You're listening to the Intrepid radio program with Scotty Roberts. Intelligent talk.
Folks, this is Scotty Roberts. You're listening to my show, the Intrepid radio program, right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. And I'm going to admit something to you right here and now. As I've said before, I mostly pre-record this show a few hours before airtime. And that's due to my tech and stuff on this end, and I got to update my software and get to the place where I can go live and broadcast to both the Odyssey radio stream, as well as over to my YouTube stream and other streams that pick this show up. It's just easier to pre-record right now. So you're getting me very relevant. It's usually an hour or two or three or four before the show starts, and I've got it. And then I go sit live in the chat room over on my YouTube channel. That's youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. Oh, and of course, you can listen to this audibly on Odyssey Radio, ODYSY1.com. But having said all that, I'm recording rather early this morning. My face isn't even awake yet. I just thought, since I'm up very early, which I am most mornings anyway these days, I thought I would record this show now and get her done early in the day. So this show is being recorded roughly, 14 hours before it actually airs. So it's still today, and God willing, and hopefully the world hasn't gone into mass decay over the next 14 hours, or over the last 14 hours since I recorded this, and you're listening to this pseudo live right now. So welcome to the program. And all those of you over in the chat room, I'm probably saying hi to you over there already. Thanks for being here this morning. And so if my face looks only half woke this morning, and I hate that word, woke. We talk about that a lot on Rocky's show. Woke is the cheap, silly, stupid, insipid term for knowing something. Over in the vernacular of the day in politics. As you know from this show, I believe in being awake and being aware, and those are two very vastly different things than being woke. Woke to me is the past term of waking up. So I am barely woke today, and we'll carry ourselves through the show, but my mind is clicking. It's sharp, it's hot, it's on. But the bodily reaction to being just recently woke is going to sound a little, you can tell by my voice already. I haven't done any talking yet today until just this moment. And my face, as my daughters would say, my young children would say, "Dad, you look Chinese this morning." And so you can see my face is not quite woke yet. But we'll get there, hopefully during the course of this show. Now, I want to talk about a couple of things today in relation to Solomon. We're going to wrap up the archaeology of the Temple Mount and hopefully get a little bit more about Solomon himself and his coming to the throne and all of that. Let's see how we do with our time this morning. We're about 3.5 minutes into the show, into the first segment. Let's see what we can tackle today, all right? Now, we've already talked about the archaeology of the Temple Mount. I've already talked about how it's possible there have been some theories that say that Solomon's temple, and therefore the following temples, Zerubbabel's rebuild of the temple after the Babylonian captivity, and Herod the Great's expansion and reconstruction of the temple, all took place on the same spot. And the theory is going like this, is that spot may have been south of the existing site. And so they're looking at the geography, looking at the biblical texts, trying to find that place. Now, they've done archaeology there, and they've found things that seem to support there was some kind of temple structure there. Now, the problem being, as we already have covered, is the great traditional Temple Mount where you see the Dome of the Rock today is unexcavatable. If that's not really even a word, but you get what I mean. Because it's owned and operated, and it is Muslim territory, Muslim turf, since about 1,200 years ago, something like that. That spot you cannot excavate there. There were older excavations before modern times, and so there's some rubble there. But keep in mind, you've got layers underneath there that you cannot excavate today. Until there was, and we did cover this yesterday, there was a joint effort, a kind of quiet, small effort that had taken place, and they did find artifacts beneath the Temple Mount, today's traditional Temple Mount, beneath the Mosque of Omar, the Dome of the Rock, that show that there is pottery and other artifacts dating back to the period of the mid-10th century to the late 10th century, which would put it smack in the reign of Solomon the king. So, and of course, we're kind of sidestepping the whole thing of did Solomon actually exist? Yeah, you can pretty much know that Solomon existed. There's scant archaeological evidence that he was the king of Israel, but there is some. And where you've got some, there's more somewhere. And it's buried beneath. Remember, Solomon's temple was built there. Then it was destroyed by Babylon. Then, out of that rubble, they cleared the rubble. They made a new platform for the temple, and they built a new temple. And then that temple was refurbished, reconstructed by Herod. And then that temple was destroyed by the Romans. Boom, leveled. And then it was paved over, and centuries went by, and then they built the Dome of the Rock is there. So there is archaeology, but you'd have to be allowed to dig deep, and that hasn't been allowed. Just little minor excursions. And so in recent years, there have been all kinds. I'm going to recap just a little bit for you here. In recent years, there have been denials that any Jewish temples ever existed in Jerusalem on what today is known as the Temple Mount. And now every other theory is making the rounds. It's following from similar ideas that are put forward decades ago, proposing that the Jerusalem temples never existed on the Temple Mount, but instead were located several hundred yards to the south over the Gihon Spring, the original water source for ancient Jerusalem. And according to this theory, that area that's been identified as the Temple Mount for the last 2,000 years is actually the site of the Antonia Fortress that was built by Herod the Great and later used by the Romans. So they're saying that whole platform, get that? Let's clear that fact we've covered a few times. That whole platform that you see now, where the Dome of the Rock sits, was the Roman fort, according to this theory. And now, to our knowledge, this theory isn't supported by any trained Western archaeologists today. It's built on a number of flawed assumptions, and it's contradicted by a great deal of biblical, historical, and archaeological evidence. And regrettably, that since it ignores or denies the clear evidence that exists, it also plays into the hands of those who deny any Jewish presence or Jewish temple in Jerusalem whatsoever. So the people who claim that, there was never ever a temple in Jerusalem of the Jews. And first, common sense would say to me, if Jerusalem was the capital city of ancient Israel, and they had a temple, according to the biblical text, they had a temple, and it was somewhere. Archaeology would say, history would say, it was where you think it ought to be, where it's traditionally been, beneath where the Dome of the Rock sits today. But people will use the fact that there is no archaeological digs that have been done or excavating in modern times. that there's no way to prove that. And since there are theories that say it laid to the south, that there's no way to prove that the temple actually existed. And so in understanding the history of Jerusalem, you need to be aware of the limitations of the archaeological evidence. One is simply that Jerusalem is a thriving, growing, active city, and it has been throughout the ages. There's modern houses, there's businesses, there's streets, there's schools, there's shops that all lie atop whatever ruins exist from ancient times. If you go to the city of David today, there is a neighborhood there, but there's a lot of archaeology going on there too. This is one of the places in the city where they have done extensive archaeological research. And this whole thing makes it very extraordinarily difficult to excavate in and around ancient Jerusalem. And the situation isn't helped by the fact that the city's been fought over dozens and dozens of times over the centuries. It's been destroyed, it's been rebuilt several more times. The whole city has. Now, nor does it help us that the temple constructed by King Solomon was destroyed by Babylonian invaders. And that was at 587 BCE. And the ruins were covered and built by a massive foundation platform atop which a later temple was built by Zerubbabel, like Solomon's temple, and the temple of the day of Jesus when he was alive. Herod's temple was so thoroughly destroyed in the Roman conquest of Jerusalem in AD 70 that there was not, as was prophesied by Jesus in the Gospels, not one stone left on top of another. And then, of course, that was all paved over, and that platform, by paved, I mean it was cleared, and there was a new platform built in ancient times, and the Dome of the Rock sits there now. So when it comes to the scarcity of archaeological remains, it was also common up until very recent times to recycle building stones in these new structures that were put up. And it made it very difficult, if not impossible, to locate more than a fraction of the original pieces of those original buildings that stood there. But in spite of these challenges, there are firm, clear remains that can be seen today that mesh perfectly with historical eyewitness accounts from those who personally saw the structures or knew those who did. And so there's all kinds of evidence that exists. And for time and dragging this on for more days, I'm not going to exhaustively go through all the evidence that exists. And I've seen it, looked at it, read it, thought about it, mulled it over, examined it in comparison to the alternative site evidences. And but I want to look at a few things here. First question is, where does the Bible actually place the Jerusalem temples? And the Bible and history are clear that Solomon's temple and the later temple built by Zerubbabel over the top of it after the Babylonian captivity were constructed on the same spot. You can look at verses like Ezra 3:3, Ezra 5:15, Ezra 16:7. We can look at one of these. Nah, let's not. It's just going to take time because I didn't call it up ahead of time. But you go to the little book of Ezra, and you're going to find references as to where the temple was built. And this would be the second temple. Herod the Great later built his great temple, the one that existed in Jesus' day, on the location of Zerubbabel's temple. And where was this spot? You can read it in 2 Chronicles 3:1. That's Solomon. We covered this a little bit yesterday. Some of this we're still in a bit of recap, eking our way into today's information. Solomon began to build the house of the Lord at Jerusalem on Mount Moriah, where the Lord had appeared to his father David, at the place that David had prepared the threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite. And that's Chronicles, 1 Chronicles 3:1, 2 Chronicles 3:1. And the account of King David purchasing the threshing floor of Ornan is recorded in 1 Chronicles 21. So you can look these verses up. Now, if I was preaching, I would say, turn in your Bibles to 1 Corinthians or 1 Chronicles 21, chapter 21, verse 14 through, and so on. But we're not going to do that today. I'll make reference. You can go look those things up. Now, a brief overview of the geography of Jerusalem is really helpful at this point. The Jebusite city that David captured and chose as his capital, naming it Jerusalem, was a walled city located on a narrow ridge that tapered to a point as it descended in elevation from north to south. And as the ridge gained elevation to the north, it widened and it flattened into a plateau. And though it was still the highest near the center of the ridge. And so the Jebusite city, well fortified with strong walls, behind which its defenders felt confident enough to mock David's soldiers, telling them that the blind and the lame men could prevent an army from entering the city. That's in 2 Samuel 5, by the way. You can't capture us. Our blind and lame can defend this city. Our walls are so great. But the walled city, which would come to be known as the City of David, following its capture, was actually really small. And we've talked about this, and I've shown you pictures of this and diagrams of this and maps of this. And it covers only about 9 to 12 acres in that range of space, depending on what you consider as being part of the city at the time that David conquered it. And steep valleys on the east and the west. You've got the Tyropian Valley of the Cheesemakers, and you've got the Kidron Valley between the Mount of Olives and the city. It made it virtually impregnable. And archaeological excavations in recent years have uncovered strong defensive towers that protected the city's water source, the Gihon Spring, the only source feeding water naturally from the city. And that, of course, that spring is still there today. And it was at the base of the ridge that emptied into the Kidron Valley between the ridge and the Mount of Olives to the east. And as noted already this week, the temple itself was built on the threshing floor that said it belonged to Ornan, who the definition of the word Ornan is actually Lord. So he was the king, and there was a verse that said, and Ornan the king said to the king, I'll just give you the land. And this is after, he was conquered, of course. And David says, no, we'll buy it from you, so it's ours. And even though David conquered the city. And so it was a threshing floor. The Bible confirms that the location of the threshing floor on which the temple was built was up. The word up is used as up in the higher elevation from the city of David. And in light of the geography of the ridge on which the city was built, which widened and gained in elevation to the north, this makes the area to the north of the city the only area in which a temple could actually really be built. Now, you might have synagogues, smaller versions of a temple, of a local meeting places, things like that could have been built on the city of David, but certainly not the temple itself. And so the city was surrounded by the steep valleys on all other sides. And this is the only logical location for a threshing floor. It was the highest piece of land in the city, and it was flat. And where I showed you the picture the other day of the rock, and so this could possibly not possibly be the threshing floor. Well, that rock is only about as big as the dome of the rock itself that sits over it. The rest of the area up there was flat. And they needed that for the wind to be able to carry off the chaff. And so the Bible tells us Solomon had finished the temple, and when it was to be dedicated, he and the elders of Israel brought the Ark of the Covenant up from the city of David. That's in 1 Kings 8:1. The emphasis is added throughout that he brought the Ark of the Covenant up from the city. And so the fact that the ark was moved up from the city of David means that it was brought out of the city of David, and that's in kind of a literal translation of the verse, to the newly constructed temple, which was about a third of a mile up, which when you think about it, it's about the distance of what's a third of a mile. 3 blocks, 3 city blocks, something like that, 4 city blocks. And so the Bible account mentions 8 times in 1 Kings 8, and the parallel account in 2 Chronicles 5, that they brought the ark up from the city of David to the temple. And really, the language, the linguistics used is proving the temple was uphill and outside the city of David. Exactly where the Temple Mount is now, and has been for almost 3,000 years. So you can see from these passages that any argument that the temple stood within the area of the original city of David is directly contradicted by plain statements of Scripture, brought up and out of the city. And it couldn't have been located directly atop the Gihon Spring, because the Gihon Spring is located downhill in the city of David, toward the Kidron Valley at an elevation more than 100 feet below that of the city. So there you go. Just by literal interpretation of the language being used, the Ark of the Covenant would have been brought up and out of the city, not down to where the Gihon Spring sits. Now, archaeological evidence for the Temple Mount being the temple location. Now, one of those is the Jewish ritual baths. It's odd to feel a need to argue that the structure, recognized for the last 2,000 years as a foundational platform for Herod's temple, is exactly that, since it itself is 36 acres of proof. Nonetheless, we'll recap some of the archaeological proof here now, that this was indeed the actual temple location. And while it's tempting and sometimes fun and it's curious to entertain some of the alternative thoughts, the alternative locations, I don't think they all pan out, even though they've got their own evidences that they use for this. One of the most striking proofs that the Temple Mount was considered a holy place is the large number of Jewish ritual purification baths called mikvat or mikvaat, and it's the plural of mikvah, and all around the Temple Mount. Existing today, all around that mount, on the outside are all these ritual Jewish baths. So far more than 100 of them have been found, and they range in size from being able to accommodate one person at a time to dozens or 100 or more worshipers at one time. So incidentally, this large number of mikvat explains how the apostles were able to find sufficient water to baptize 3,000 people in one day on the Feast of Pentecost at the temple in the book of Acts in the New Testament, Acts 2:41. 3,000 people in one day. And the ritual baths, by the way, they would step into the pools, they would wash their feet and hands and so on. It's like going to the Ganges River in New Delhi. And so during Jesus' time, it was common for worshipers going up to the temple to ritually immerse themselves in water so they could enter the temple precincts in a ritually pure state. And incidentally, this practice of ritual washing was carried over to a number of synagogues in Israel where similar mikvat have been found dating to the period. And the practice has been continued at many synagogues elsewhere in centuries since, all around the world. And so archaeologist Eliot Matzar, who we talked about yesterday, she describes what was uncovered in the excavations along the southern and western walls of the Temple Mount, overseen by her grandfather, Benjamin Matzar. Dozens of ritual baths dating to the Herodian period were found all throughout the excavation site around the Temple Mount. Rock-cut channels directed water into the baths from the surplus and the colossal cisterns on the Temple Mount, and each bath had one entrance with stairs and a lower parapet in the center that separated those entering for purification from those leaving after purification. And wherever archaeologists have excavated around the Temple Mount, all over the south and west sides, in what little digging has been done to the north, they found Jewish ritual baths dating to the first centuries BC and AD. And the only area they haven't found them is on the east side, where a large Muslim cemetery prevents any archaeological exploration. You've seen all those cemeteries that are in there. And it's been revealed recently from long-hidden historical records that after 1927 earthquake in Jerusalem damaged the Al-Aqsa Mosque, on the Temple Mount, British archaeologist Robert Hamilton discovered and documented the remains of the first century Jewish mikvat. underneath its floor. And it's a find that's kept hidden for almost a century, so not to arouse Muslim anger at such clear evidence of Jewish worship on the Temple Mount. And guys, we're at the end of the first segment. We got to take a break. We'll come back. We'll pick this up where we left off. Sit tight. All right, folks, thanks for sitting on through that break. This is Scotty Roberts. You're listening to my show, the Intrepid Radio Program, right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. That's ODYSY1.com. You can also come on over to my YouTube channel, watch the simulcast video, join the chat room where all the other Intrepheads are joined tonight and already chatting with me over there as well, because I actually pre-recorded this quite early today. And since you're watching this now and listening to this now, the earth, the world obviously did not come to a bitter end today. I hope you're enjoying the show. Let's pick up where we left off. But first, go over to my YouTube channel. If you want to see join the chat room, see the video version of this, that's over at youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. Now, we left off, we're talking about these ritual baths that have been found all around, archaeologically, around the temple compound. They can't dig into the temple compound because of the Muslim-Jewish conflict that is there. But all around they found all these ritual baths. And it was Robert Hamilton, that was where we left off, a British archaeologist in 1927, after the earthquake cracked the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and that underneath the floor they found mikveh. And it's a find that was kept hidden for almost a century because of all the political tensions that go on there over who owns the Temple Mount religiously. God wants us to fight over this land, in other words. So, of course, all of the dozens of ritual baths surrounding and atop the Temple Mount make no sense if this was the Antonia Fortress, the fortress of the Romans, as those who wish to relocate the temple try to argue that that's the Antonia Fortress. And it makes no sense that the Jews would have been ritually bathing themselves all around a Roman military fortress. But it makes perfect sense if they were purifying themselves before ascending to the temple to worship. So, in stark contrast, in many excavation sites over many years of digging, no such baths or any evidence of any kind of Jewish worship practice have been found where some would relocate the temple above the Gihon Spring. Just didn't exist. So now there's finds that are corresponding with Josephus's temple description. Flavius Josephus, Flavius Josephus, historian, he was prolific first century Jewish scholar, historian, priest, intimately familiar with Jerusalem and the temple, and the war in which both were destroyed by the Romans. In his writings, he gives many descriptions of the temple that allow us to correlate it with the Temple Mount. But I want to focus on just a few archaeological finds. Josephus records that the outer court of the temple complex, known as the Court of the Gentiles, into which Gentiles could enter. That's why you've got a 36-acre plot for the temple, by the way. That whole temple open compound was open, and there was a court that was open to the Gentiles and the non-Jewish people, the Goy. It was encompassed by a stone wall for a partition with an inscription which forbade any foreigner to go in under pain of death. You could not enter if you were a foreigner, if you were not Jewish, if you were not an Israelite. And that was in Josephus's Antiquities of the Jews, Book 15, Chapter 11, Section 5. You can go find it. And in his work, Wars of the Jews, he states that there were a number of these signs on this wall, some in Greek, some in Roman letters, that no foreigner should go within that sanctuary. Now, two of these stone do not enter signs, one complete and the other with the ends missing, have been found. The complete one was found in 1871, about 150 feet from the Temple Mount, and the partial one was found in 1935 in an excavation about 200 feet north of the northeast corner of the Temple Mount, and that platform, so way up on the other end, on the north. And so both were found reused in other structures, showing how ancient building materials were often scavenged and reused in other ways. Remember when I showed you the picture, and I've talked a few times over different shows about the cornerstone of Pontius Pilate dedicating the Tiberium, that gymnasium in Caesarea Philippi. You know where they found that stone? It was found built into a stairway. It had been refurbished several hundred years later, probably, when that gymnasium was falling down, taken apart, and they scavenged the stone to build a stairway within the city of Caesarea Philippi. So stones were reused. The carved Greek inscription on the complete stone spelled out what Josephus summarized, and it reads this. This is the stone they found. No foreigner may enter within the balustrade around the sanctuary and the enclosure. Whoever is caught, on himself shall be put blame for the death which will ensue. That was the sign that they found to the north of the temple compound. Not the south toward the city of David, but to the north. Now, Josephus also describes a part of the temple complex where it was custom for one of the priests to stand and to give notice by the sound of a trumpet in the afternoon of the approach and on the following evening of the close of every seventh day. This was in Josephus's Wars of the Jews, Book 4, Chapter 9, Section 12. So for this trumpet blast announcing the beginning and ending of the Sabbath day to be meaningful, it logically meant it must have taken place at a part of the temple where it could be heard throughout much of the city. Now, in 1968, Hebrew University archaeologist Benjamin Matzar found a large carved stone in the rubble of the destruction of the temple complex at the southwest corner of the Temple Mount platform. Now, this would be north of the city of David, but on the west side, on kind of the Cheesemaker Valley area. And remember, all this rubble that has fallen away from the temple or been pushed out or cleared out, shoved into the valleys of what wasn't populated areas so much, all of that stuff over the centuries has gathered up in these heaps. And this is where they can excavate all the way up to the walls of the old Temple Mount, which is, of course, now Muslim territory. And so, in this rubble, the stone was buried at the bottom of the rubble, and from some of the temple's outer buildings, meaning it had likely fallen from the very top of the structures built around the edges of the platform. That's why it ends up at the bottom of the heap. So carved in elaborate Hebrew script on the stone were the words, "To the trumpeting place to declare, ... and it was broken off. With the remainder of the inscription was broken off, it was lost. Temple experts believe that the full description read, "To the trumpeting place to declare the Sabbath," which is what Josephus talked about, which was the practice, and that the stone fell from the spot to which Josephus referred, particularly since the broken stone fit perfectly onto a much larger block of stone that had a niche carved out just right for the size of a man to stand, to hold the trumpet and declare the Sabbath. Josephus also describes the western side of the temple platform as having 4 entrance points, one accessed by a bridge crossing the Tyropean Valley, the cheesemakers people, and to Jesus' wealthy upper city, 2 that opened to the rest of the city, and a 4th involving a great number of steps located where the road descended down into the valley. And this was in Josephus' Antiquities of the Jews again. Now today, the Western Wall, the Wailing Wall, where you see all the famous pictures, and we've talked about this, the one part of the structure of the temple platform that still exists, that dates back to Herod's time, that this was part of the temple platform. It's the wall. And you can see it remains, the remains of one of these 4 entrances to the Temple Mount, exactly as Josephus explained them. And it was named after the famous Jerusalem archaeologists, and they're called respectively Wilson's Arch, which is the remains of a bridge that crossed the Tyropean Valley, Warren's Gate, Barclay's Gate, and the very famous Robinson's Arch, which is the remains of a massive staircase that indeed had a great number of steps leading down to the first century road that had that descended down into the valley, exactly as Josephus had described. I want to show you something here, and I didn't prepare for this, so I'm going to look it up right now, and we'll find this right now. I want to find you a picture of Robinson's Arch, and also a picture of what this would have looked like in its day. Let's see. Oh, I'm seeing little tiny pictures here. Let me see if I can grab a bigger picture. And I can't just share it. I've got to import it. So give me a second here to grab this and import it for you right here. This is Robinson's Arch. Now, this is a model of this that still exists. Let me save this to my computer. And those of you, sorry if you're listening on radio, you're not going to be able to see this, but I'll describe it to you. This is a picture of the model, and then, of course, we have pictures of the actual arch as it exists today. Robinson's Arch is here, and it's really hard to tell. Now, I'm saving 2 images here so I can show you both of these. This is Robinson's Arch, and we'll save it to the same place. Okay, now you guys watch your screen over there. I'm going to import this, and I've got to do it this way. I've got to go Rob Arch model. All right, let's bring this in so you can see it. This is, and I think this is just interesting to be able to see this stuff. This is part of the big model that was built. No, this is the actual, now this is the arch as it sits today. Now take a look at this. If you see what you're looking at here, let's make sure I have that filling the area for us. All right, yeah, there we go. All right, you see in this photo, this is on the western side of the temple platform where the Dome of the Rock sits. If you look at this right here, that rubble down on the ground, and then the wall on the right, and you see the blue sky, of course, above you. This area that extends here is part of the Tyropean Valley, the Valley of the Cheesemakers, that descends down into the valley there. And if you look on the wall on the far right of this photo, you can see that those raised stones coming out of the wall. That was the beginning of the arch, of the bridge that went from the old temple compound onto the bridge and crossed the Tyropoeon Valley into the old city of Jerusalem. And there were 4 of these bridges. So this was the one arch they discovered, and this is what it looks like today. And you can see the metal stairways and walkways all around that were installed. This is so, tourists can come and they can look. This is where one of these arches stood, and this one's referred to as Robinson's Arch because he was the dude that found it. And now if I was to show you what this looked like in its day, let's look at the arch model. Now, keep this picture in your head right now. Let's look at Robinson's Arch, the reconstruction of what this would have looked like. Boom, right here. Now, you see this? I'm going to move this over so you can see. You see that raised area in the other picture to the right, the far right of this image. You can see the raised area where the arch would have come out of the temple. The bridge leading on this particular one, this is to the stairway. And so that would have been the area right smack almost in the center. You see an arch on this picture, on this model of, this is the southwest corner of the temple compound. And this is the arch you see right there. You can see the arch just standing out. Look again back here. I move it over. You can see the old arch. This is where this came out of the temple wall. And this was the stairway that led all the way down into the valley of the cheesemakers. All right, so that's a good visual reference. Again, sorry on the radio that you can't hear all of that or see all of that, but you can come over, take a look at this at your leisure anytime you want in the archives. So let's put this away, these pictures. So this is what we're talking about when we're talking about these arches that were discovered. And these places that show you what was going on. So this was Robinson's Gate, and all these archways were the beginnings of the bridges that led across the Tyropoeon Valley, except for this one, Robinson's, which had the stairway going down. Now Josephus further describes an astoundingly impressive colonnade, better than any under the sun, he says, and it ran along the southern top of the temple platform. And Benjamin Matzar finds from his excavations along the southern wall of the Temple Mount from 1968 to 1978, he again matched the description given by Josephus. Numerous fragments of such pilasters, rectangular pillars that were set into the walls, and their capitals, the tops of them, as well as pieces from 2 stone sundials, together with fragments from other architectural elements, including friezes, panels, cornices, some of which fell from the top of the wall, and some from which the royal portico, a huge columned structure that ran along the top of the southern wall of the Temple Mount, were found in abundance among the debris which had accumulated along the area facing the whole length of the southern wall of this compound, and close to the western wall, the Wailing Wall. And now these fragments bear typical Herodian decorations, comprising the rich variety of these geometric as well as floral patterns that were characteristic of the artistic repertoire of the period. And Josephus also added that the southern side of the temple platform had gates in the middle. Today, one can visit the Temple Mount and see 2 sets of gates known as the double gate and the triple gate in the middle of the walls, exactly as Josephus places them. And Josephus lists 1 large gate on the east side, but doesn't specify a number for the north side. But these areas today lie underneath a Muslim cemetery in the Muslim portion of the city, and no excavations have been carried out along these walls. I can show you here some of the pictures that we've had up over the last few days. Here's the model of Herod's temple. Take a look at this again. You see on the far left of this picture, see the red tiled roof portion here? This is all, and you can see all the colonnades running along the west wall, all along the north wall, all around this whole compound. But this is the area that they were talking about that off to the south, on the far left of this picture, of this model, all of this would have crumbled and fallen down onto the ground there. And this is where Benjamin Finkelstein found a lot of these remnants of glorious structure of this temple. And so there you go. That's the some of the ruins. Now, since the Temple Mount has been in the hands of Muslim authorities, they haven't allowed any meaningful archaeological exploration in this or the last century. In fact, there's an abundant evidence of Muslim authority destroying ancient remains on the Temple Mount, presumably to erase any evidence of a Jewish presence there whatsoever. So due to the impossibility of any scientific exploration of the Temple Mount anytime soon, other evidence lying beneath its surface that would further confirm this is the temple location are going to forever remain a mystery. And that, to me, is a travesty when you elevate politics and religion above finding historical fact. Who the hell cares? If the Muslims are there today, you're there today, you got the mosque. All they're saying is that if they were able, if Jews or Israel was able to establish that a temple stood there with unrefutable archaeological fact, then they're thinking they could technically lay claim to the ground beneath the Mosque of Omar. And the problem being is that they have destroyed evidence of the temple going along the way. So those of you who say there's no temple, that it never existed, there is plenty of archaeological evidence. Look to the work of Benjamin Finkelstein. Look to the work, of Finkelstein. Look to the work of Benjamin Matzar. And you're going to find that you're going to look to the work of all these archaeologists. Eilert Matzar, who works on the north side of the city of David. You're going to find endless amounts of information archaeologically that state that temple stood on that site. And so I believe the Temple Mount is the actual site of the ancient temple in Jerusalem. Now, archaeology, let's go on a little bit further, also disproves that any temple stood ever above the Gihon Spring. In the first century A.D., when some argue that the Jerusalem temple was located on the ridge above the Gihon Spring, what was that area like? From 1995 until his retirement in 2011, University of Haifa professor Ronnie Reich, recipient of multiple awards for his outstanding contributions to the field of archaeology, was co-author of an excavation in the city of David. In that capacity, he oversaw archaeological explorations all around the Gihon Spring area, and including the steep slopes of the ridge on which the city of David lay. And his findings contributed a great deal to our understanding of the history of the area. So what did he find in this area, where some would place the Jerusalem temples? In his 2011 book, Excavating the City of David, where Jerusalem's history began, Dr. Reich explains that what they had to dig through all around the Gihon Spring, the stone, the soil, the clusters, all the pottery and the sherds of fragments of finds, all spilled down across the eastern slopes of the city of David. And he describes how a similar thick overlay covered other nearby sites excavated by previous archaeologists. Let me see if I can show you here. Is this the one I want to show you? No. I want to show you a picture. Do I even have it in here? Here we go. All right, now you see this picture? Those of you watching on video, it's just a painting. It's the painting by Balazs Ballot of the old city of David, and showing the temple compound on top of Mount Moriah. Now, if you look about center in the picture, you see the city walls, and then you see these long, narrow structures, the city walls, extending out on this slope down at the middle center of the picture. And this is where the Gihon Spring is located. Now, what they're talking about on all these eastern slopes, this whole side of the city of David, running from about the middle of this picture down to the lower left of this picture, that's the eastern wall of the city of David. And so when it's talking about Reich doing excavation work, he did most of his work around this, the Gihon Spring, that walled area that comes out of the city, and then also all across that eastern slope, which goes down into the Kidron Valley. And when you come up this side of the Kidron, of course, you're on the Mount of Olives. So that gives you a little visual context for what we're talking about here. So what was the thick overlay of material that Reich discovered? There was a huge amount of debris, and it was in the realm of hundreds of thousands of cubic feet of cubic yards, cubic meters of material. It was not long before we realized, Reich says, that we'd been dealing all along with the Jerusalem city dump from the end of the Second Temple period. And so this thick layer of debris all along the east was the dump. People came there and dumped everything off the eastern slope. So rather than this being the site of Herod's glorious temple, where Jesus Christ visited and taught, the area above and around the Gihon Spring was actually the site of the city dump in Jesus' day. Now, additional archaeological excavation, and they know this by archaeological excavation and examination of the debris that was piled up down at the bottom. Now, additional archaeological excavation reports show that during the period of Solomon's temple, this same slope was covered with agricultural terraces of the same kind that are seen all around Jerusalem today for growing olive trees, again showing the impossibility of a temple site ever being located there. Now, in addition to these excavations all around and above the Gihon Spring, including at least 8 where someone would mistakenly relocate the temple, archaeologists have dug through all levels of human occupation in many nearby areas of the city of David, and nothing remotely indicates that the Jerusalem temple had ever been located there. And as some imagine, in spite of many decades of digging, dating back to 1867, more than 150 years ago, nothing remotely resembling the remains of a temple in Jerusalem have been found on that site. There is simply zero evidence to support that idea. And the extensive excavations that have been conducted there conclusively prove the temples of the Bible never existed on that spot, the alternative location. So there, I think we've settled that matter as much as we can here today. We could spend another 5 shows going through all the different archaeological evidence that show that the temple most likely was located on the Temple Mount, and that could not have been the Antonia fortress. And we're out of time. Tomorrow, I want to wrap this up because I got a little more information on the Antonia fortress that we can cover, and I want to get a little back into Solomon's mom, which we covered in my series on David almost a year ago. But I want to we'll wrap up Solomon by talking about his mom and how he took the throne. And so, folks, there it is. That's all we got today. Thanks for being here. Thanks for being part of this show. And we'll see you in about 23 hours right back here. Sit tight.